Good evening, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the pictures from years past of this event. I want to welcome everyone to the 26th edition of the Theodore D. Veru Symposium. My name is Steve Mulready, and I'm the Dean of the Austin D. Barney School of Business, and we're hosting the symposium in the Wild Auditorium on the campus of the University of Hartford and streaming the event to an additional 150 guests tonight. So thanks to all the virtual guests who are joining us. And thank you also to Dan Veru and his company, Palisade Capital, for their co-sponsorship of tonight's event. The Veru Symposium is our school's premier thought event of the year. It was founded in the early 1990s by Peter Veru in honor of his father, Theodore. Before I introduce and turn the program over to Peter, I want to introduce some people in the audience here. Sam Bromer is our vice chairman of the school's Board of Visitors. Sam, if you stand. We have Kate Pendergast, vice president of Development and Alumni Affairs over here. I don't think she was standing. Alex Corey in front of us here, director of development for She's the one behind the scenes that put this all together, so thanks, Alex. Brandon Evans, Development Associate of the Business School. Brandon. And I'd also like the faculty just to stand to get some acknowledgement. They're a terrific group, and if you will, just to show the audience here who's here. Okay, you saw, those of you that have been around for a while, saw pictures of Charles Kennedy here in the film. Charles was a beloved faculty member, and he was someone who did so much working with Peter to make sure that this became a very successful annual event. And what's happened is at Charles' retirement a couple of years ago, one of our alum, Chuck Seaman, made an endowed gift to start the Charles Kennedy Endowed Scholarship. And I'm pleased to announce the 2022 winners of this scholarship. And I believe at least one of them is here. And that's Darian Stevens, a junior pursuing a degree in marketing. Please come forward and receive your award. And, you know what, why don't we do it down here, because I'd like Peter, if you would also stand with there for the picture. And let me. And our second recipient is Albany Hunt, a sophomore pursuing a degree in digital marketing and journalism with a minor in marketing. And you're here. Wonderful. Okay. As mentioned, the symposium was created in honor of Peter and Dan's father, Theodore Veru, And Theodore and his wife, Georgia, often came here to enjoy the speakers and the event as much as you'll enjoy it this evening. Sadly, Theodore passed away at the end of last year in December. And as a remembrance, we wanted to present to Peter and Dan a photo of the four of them, mother and father and the two sons. And now the main event. I'll now introduce the one who made this event possible all these years. Peter is a 1985 graduate of the School of Business with a degree in marketing. And when he graduated, he had a very interesting career that followed. He spent 7 years on Wall Street as managing director of Toronto Dominion and another 9 years as bond trader at Bear Stearns. Leaving Wall Street, he took up his musical talent as a guitarist and vocalist and formed a band called the Feather Merchants. They performed for a number of years and released albums. And if I got this correctly, the last one was in 2018? Eight. Okay.
Oh, wait, no, you're right. The library. That's right. The library. I forgot about that.
My goodness, look who's here. Charles, come on down. So now I know how show hosts have to adapt. Charles, good to have you here. We were saying a special guest was going to be here, a special guest of the family, and a cherished retired faculty member, Professor Emeritus Charles Kennedy. So thank you for being here. We just awarded the 2 scholarships to Albany Hunt and Darian Stevens at the end of the ceremony here. We'll take pictures with them and with Peter as well. So thanks for being here. So last we were talking, the band put out their last album in 2018. So leaving Wall Street, I mentioned that. Peter has a keen interest in history. And he enrolled into George Washington University and earned a Master's of Art in American History. He continued his education and traveled to Amsterdam to research the Dutch's involvement in the U.S. in the early days of our country. Returning to the U.S., he continued his studies, doing research, and he wrote his dissertation, earning a Ph.D. from the University of Colorado in Boulder. He has 2 published articles and working on a book entitled Bonds of Independence, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, and the Dutch Connection with the period 1780 to 1803. I have read 2 dissertations in my life. One of them was my wife's, and the other one was Peter's. And I only felt I needed to read one. My pleasure to introduce Peter Veru.
You'll never have to prove your bravery in any other way, by the way. Thank you, Dean. We wish you a long and successful tenure and look forward to many informative evenings like this one under your leadership. A special thanks also to Alex Curry for playing a critical role in putting this night together. Thank you, Alex. Also, Jim Chapdelaine, who put together that marvelous montage at the beginning of the evening. He knows his stuff. Good evening. On behalf of me, my family, and the University of Hartford and the Barney School of Business, we welcome you to the 26th Theodore D. Veru Symposium. We stand on shoulders of giants. For 23 years, Dr. Charles Kennedy grew the popularity and prestige of this program until it was recognized as a signature event in the Barney School. Charles is off enjoying his retirement, but I wanted to make sure that his efforts were recognized, and apparently he's here now, so wonderful. We begin tonight on a somber note. In 1997, I endowed this symposium with two goals in mind: to inspire and to inform. I named it after our father, Theodore D. Veru. Dad passed on Christmas Eve, 4 months short of his 96th birthday. I named the symposium after Dad because he was a pioneer in the field of marketing. Dad served in World War II, and when he graduated, he went to NYU on the GI Bill. One professor in the marketing department recognized Dad's potential and got NYU to offer him a tenure-track position in the marketing department, which he declined. Dad was the prototypical real-world marketing professional, and the real world is where he belonged. Dad started in the food distribution business and quickly realized that supermarkets were selling things like razor blades and toothbrushes. Dad reasoned that if this were the case, why then could drugstores not sell things like food? Overnight, the modern drugstore was born. So when you go into a drugstore at 3 a.m. for a can of Pringles or a gallon of milk, try and remember it was not always possible. Dad moved into the distilled spirits business, assuming the title of vice president at Shenley Incorporated, where he was responsible for developing their flagship Scotch Dewar's White Label. If an athletic shoe company wished to sell a new model of sneaker, they would certainly partner with an NBA basketball player. In the 1960s, if someone wanted to sell distilled spirits, they got a member of the Rat Pack to drink your brand. For 5 years, Dad hung around with entertainers like Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin. In 1965, Dad booked the ballroom of the Beverly Hills Hotel, where he was a mainstay, to honor Sammy Davis Jr., who was named Los Angeles Citizen of the Year. And who was the 1964 recipient of this award? No one. Dad just made it up, and of course, on every table during the ceremony was a bottle of Dewar's White Label. Can we have that photo, please? Yes. Now, you might be asking yourself, why is there a still from the first Godfather movie on the screen? Well, Dad left Shenley to become president of the International Division of Publicker Industries, a company with a host of distilled spirits brands. One of those brands was Pinwinnie Scotch. In the early 70s, Dad somehow talked himself into a meeting with Francis Ford Coppola's production company and got them to put a bottle of Pinwinnie Scotch in the shot. That's what that is. That square bottle in the background of this famous scene where the crime families are hammering out a peace agreement was made possible through Dad's efforts. As brand placements go, getting your product in what is arguably the greatest movie ever made is quite an achievement. In the late 70s, Dad went out on his own and acquired the now famous Michter's Distillery, the oldest distillery in the United States. Through sheer determination, Dad was able to get the distillery registered as a National Historic Landmark. No easy feat for anyone who knows anything about Washington. Michter's was a superior sour mash whiskey or bourbon. Unfortunately, the expensive process by which this was made, a stagflation economy, and the almost non-existent market for bourbon at the time made the business model untenable. It was for Dad a failure, but instead of giving up like many would, he kept moving forward. There's a lesson for all of us in that. For the last 25 years of his work career, Dad took his lifetime of marketing successes and partnered with advertising legend George Lois. Throughout the 90s and 2000s, Dad and George Lois produced campaigns for ESPN's Sunday Night Football, the Intercontinental Hotel chain, Corona Beer, Reebok, and many others. I met JFK Jr. at Dad's office when they were working on the now defunct George magazine. Dad retired, played golf, traveled, took Mom out to dinner, and before he got ill, tried to make the most of his remaining time. He will be missed, but his ethos lives on in this symposium. Moving on. Tonight, we have an exciting evening planned for you in the audience and those viewing through various streaming platforms, a first for the Veru Symposium. Few people can get through their day without hearing the words cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. Like it or not, cryptocurrency, for the time being, is part of our lives. Throughout this evening, you're going to hear words like inflation, deflation, decentralized monetary policy, negotiability, interest rates, yield curves, forward contracts, debt, and equity, but do not be overwhelmed by the terminology. What our guests tonight will hopefully be unpacking and exploring is a much simpler question. What gives something value? The obvious answer to the first asset of value is land. Plant a seed, and 100 days or so, a plant produces something that a family can eat. Soon, barter became a mainstay of most ancient economies. Around 3200 BC, the population of Babylonia grew to the point that the workforce diversified. Not everyone was a farmer, but everyone needed to eat and pay taxes to some central authority. Sometimes it was necessary to ameliorate the temporal differences between each citizen's economic activities and the tax season. The first loans were made, and the cost to the borrower was called mas, but we now know it as interest. In 1820 BC, Babylonians began to use a metal common to the area as a medium of exchange, silver. Why silver? Because it was what they had, and with that, a brand now 4,000-year-old brand name was born. Soon gold, an equally impractical metal, followed. In 600 BC, the Greeks took that silver, made them into what we call coins, and struck them with an image indicating sanction by the government. In China, around the 15th century BC, seashells became a currency accepted as far as Africa. In 16th century AD, Native American tribes would accept sewant, also called wampum, in exchange for beaver pelts. What was wampum? Ornately strung clamshells that for some Native Americans had a spiritual value. And of course, the more wampum that was made and the more silver and gold that was mined, the less the existing species was worth. This concept, particularly topical, is called inflation. Why were these things worth anything at all? Because people believed they were worth something. In many ways, it is, as economist Jim Grant said of credit, money of the mind. Let's look at the American experience for a moment. In 1776, the newly created United States was completely bereft of any meaningful amount of silver, in this case the Spanish piastre and the British pound. This was because the British recognized that specie meant independence for their former colonists. King George wanted Americans buying finished goods from British merchants on credit and settling those accounts with raw materials. The Navigation Acts of the 17th century prohibited trade with other nations, so why would colonists need silver? To counteract the lack of specie, the Continental Congress issued $260 million in continental dollars between 1776 and 1780, all valued at 1-to-1 to the Spanish silver dollar. The idea was that the states would make contributions to support this issuance, as stipulated under the Articles of Confederation, but parochial attitudes of most of the state governments and the belief many held that the Continental Congress was a wartime expedience produced only 25% of the contributions that were necessary. Simultaneously, those same states refused to cede the right to levy impost duties or excise taxes to Congress. The result was predictable. Paper money of the United States, which was 1-to-1 with the Spanish silver dollar, was exchanged for a fraction of its cost. Anyone with 100 continental dollars could expect $2 in Spanish silver, hence the expression, not worth a continental. You think 10% inflation's a lot, huh? Try 98%. And now we come to the main event. Cryptocurrency is defined as digital or virtual currency based on blockchain technology. It is immune to central government monetary policy. In fact, it exists entirely outside the control of any central government. Is the financial future of the world the preferred currency of rogue nations and drug dealers, or just another form of wampum? Tonight, we have two experts to help us unpack this. I do not envy them their task. Jason Trennert is a return speaker to the Veru Symposium and is the founder and CEO of Strategas. Strategas is an institutional brokerage and advisory firm serving the clients in 45 states and 25 countries around the world. The firm provides macro research and capital markets and corporate advisory services to institutional managers and corporate executives, and through Strategas Asset Management manages a suite of macro thematic investment strategies by investment mandate and for ultra and high net worth investors. He will join us virtually. Tom Jessup is the president of Fidelity Digital Assets. In his role, Tom is responsible for daily operations while directing the company's long-term vision to create a full-service institutional brokerage capability for native digital assets like Bitcoin and tokenized securities. To moderate tonight's proceedings, we have Dan Veru, Chief Investment Officer and co-chairman of Palisade Capital, LLC, a private investment management business founded in 1995, with over 5.4 billion in assets. Do not be alarmed. He looks and sounds quite a bit like me. Gentlemen, the stage is yours.
Oh, there he is.
Hey there.
Hey, Jason.
Hey, hi guys. How we doing?
Okay, terrific. Thank you, Peter, and to Jason and Tom, thank you very much for participating. And Jason, thank you for your second round here at the Veru Symposium. Welcome. Welcome again to a discussion on digital assets, cryptocurrency, and the future of decentralized finance. I'm very happy to have two great thought leaders for today's discussion, Tom Jessup, President of Fidelity Digital Assets, and Jason Trennert, visiting with us virtually, President and CEO of Strategic Partners. And I want, in the interest of full and fair disclosure, we are, Fidelity is a very important partner at Palisade, and so is Strategic. I rely on their macro work. They do outstanding work for us. We're planning to keep our comments under an hour. And at the end, we would like to open it up to any questions that you might have in the audience for any of our guests today. So as Peter described, many things have been held out to have value and were used as currency. To add another example to Peter's list of examples is in the 1800s, the Yap Island, today part of the Federated States of Micronesia, used rye stones as currency, and some have made the analogy of rye stones to Bitcoin today. They only came from a mine on the island and had largely been depleted, so the number of stones in circulation did not grow substantially and kept them as a steady store of value that could be traded for other goods. Everything went fine until the arrival of an Irishman named David O'Keefe, a rather colorful individual who became rich by finding another source of rye stones. Eventually, he destabilized the rye stones at the Yap Island as a currency, and the stones as a storehouse of value ended and really impoverished much of the island. The first Bitcoin began trading in July of 2010, and Tom, if I have this number right, it's 0.0008% of a dollar per Bitcoin as the first trade.
Sounds right.
Yeah, that's pretty low.
It's come a long way.
By April of 2021, the price reached $61,000 per Bitcoin. So that's a pretty good return. As digital money became an investable asset class and many other digital coins came to market as well. The growth certainly has not been a linear pathway. The price is extremely volatile, and it's not been controversy. It has not been without controversy or skeptics. Bill Gates calls digital assets a miracle of modern finance and a force for good, especially for poorer countries, while Warren Buffett was more skeptical, claiming that it doesn't create anything. Former CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt, calls digital assets a remarkable cryptographic achievement, while Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen had called it an inefficient way to conduct monetary policy, though her views, some she's expressed today, seem to be evolving and softening somewhat. Before we start our conversation, I'd like to ask the audience, by a show of hands, how many own stocks or bonds either directly or through ETFs? Okay, so it's a pretty good number. How many own any sort of cryptocurrency or digital currency? Yeah, just about the same. How many own both? Very good. There's a well-diversified group of folks here. So you've taken that as as a portfolio approach. Okay. So let's get right into it. And Tom, I'm going to start with you. How many cryptocurrencies are there currently? And at a high level, how are they differentiated? Many of them have different forms of technology backing them. So how do we unpack some of that and make sense of it all?
Yeah, so we tend to use the term digital assets. There are certain digital assets that were conceived of or meant to behave like currencies, like Bitcoin, but there are many others that have nothing to do with that use case. So if you think about there being anywhere from 4,000 plus different types of digital assets, it's very hard to actually track how many. They serve different purposes. And so I would, maybe at a very high level, talk about Bitcoin, which really was conceived in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis as a form of hard money. It really is as much a monetary invention as it is a technology invention. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin mined. That rule is enforced by a network of computers and computing power that gets stronger every minute and every day as new participants join the network. And in the face of monetary and fiscal inflation and stimulus, it's taken on properties of digital gold. There are many other assets. There's a whole other class of assets, which I would analogize to operating systems. So when you think of something like Ethereum, you've heard of Ethereum. It's the second largest market cap asset. I think an appropriate analogy, which may draw the ire of technologists, is that it's the modern day open source equivalent of an operating system like Windows or iOS or Android that anyone can develop programs on top of. And so there are many interesting things happening in that space. You've heard of NFTs, non-fungible tokens, digital artwork and music that have certain properties where the benefits of transacting those assets over time can accrue back to the artist, which is pretty cool. Those things run on these layer one networks. And in the financial sphere, there's a number of protocols that run on top of these operating systems that allow people to borrow and lend and transact in other digital assets without the need for intermediaries. So I think it is fundamentally, this whole space is a computing revolution, why folks like Eric Schmidt and Bill Gates have taken to it. But the use cases are actually quite distinct, and there are even a whole set of use cases in industry, which are also interesting to look at in terms of how you use this immutable public ledger for tracking everything from identity to health records to sort of how your lettuce got from a farm in South America to a Walmart.
All right, that's great, very helpful. Jason, I know when I do quarterly calls with our institutional clients, I'm terrified if they're going to ask me anything about cryptocurrency because I know enough to be dangerous. But I'm curious what your view is. I know I had many conversations with you about crypto, and your view at the time was, crypto's got a 10-year brand, Bitcoin's got a 10-year-old brand, gold's got a much longer brand, and Peter, you also used the example of silver. But how do you think about it from the standpoint from a strategist point of view? Is it a currency or an asset class, a floor wax, a dessert topping? It's got a variety of different ways you can think about it. So how do you approach it when you think through it?
Yeah, and let me say, it's such a pleasure to be here and a privilege. Widely accepted, however, but not yet. It's starting to become more accepted. So I would say it's not quite a currency, although it's getting there. I think it serves some of the functions of money. It is a unit of account. It's a medium of exchange for some people. Whether it's a store of value, I think, is another question that is an open-ended question, and that's part of the reason why institutional investors really are starting to invest in companies that create the technology that creates the backbone of Bitcoin and the distributed ledger and blockchain, but are not necessarily investing in digital assets themselves. I think that's partly because it's so new that there's not a regulatory framework around them to quite know what the rules are. And so at the very least, I view it as something that's becoming money. I don't think it's an asset class for institutional money yet. I think that may take more time and more rules. And it's certainly a great speculative vehicle. There's no two ways about it, and you and I have talked about that. And so in what I do, I'm just trying to get to the right answer. So I have to say I'm somewhat skeptical of Bitcoin and other digital assets. By the same token, I told Tom and Dan the other day, I mean, I wouldn't short it if you put a gun to my head. I mean, it could easily double or more over some period of time, and I'm scared senseless to get in front of that. But I do think there's a lot more rules and regulations that need to be put in place for it to become widely acceptable and really a store of value that's somewhat stable. And Tom knows all about this. I'm just learning. There are, in terms of digital assets, there are obviously there's stable coins, there's central bank digital assets. There are crypto currencies, and they all have different properties. Crypto, in my opinion, it's a little dangerous to the extent to which it's not really backed by anything. Certain cash flows doesn't really pay interest, but that's really not that different than most commodities. Let's say gold, for instance. It is interesting now that I would say modern monetary policy has actually turned some of these assets into having real returns relative to just cash. So, which is it is kind of interesting that's we've expanded the money supply in the United States to such an extent, and real interest rates are so low now that you're seeing assets actually compete with cash. And I think that's likely to continue. We could talk about that at greater lengths, but I feel quite strongly that inflation is more structural, mainly because of rents, wages, our environmental policies, that I would say some of the backup in globalization. All of those things I think are going to make inflation stickier and are going to continue to drive interest in digital assets. So that's a long-winded answer to say it's becoming a currency. It's not quite an asset class for the institutional investor, and it's probably one of the great speculative instruments or vehicles of all time.
Tom, since Jason mentioned stablecoin, how is that different than Bitcoin? And given I was thinking we were chatting the other day about the U.S. seizing Russian dollars outside of Russia and what that perhaps means for digital assets, digital currency.
Yeah, so the way to think about a stable coin, so what's interesting about the technologies, you have what are called native digital assets. These are assets that are at the protocol level. Ethereum, again, being an example. You can also represent other types of assets on blockchains. And so stablecoin is really a representation of, in some cases, a dollar, euro, yen, that theoretically would sit in a bank account somewhere, and you would receive a token on a network that you can transact in. And actually, the primary use case now for stablecoins is doing trade settlement against other crypto assets. So for folks that trade assets, they want to move in and out quickly into a stable value instrument. They might sell Bitcoin for USDC, which is one stablecoin, or Tether, fairly controversial stablecoin. And it's really used in the cryptosphere now to affect the very quick DVP, instantaneous settlement transactions. But what you're starting to see are companies bring stablecoins more into the mainstream as a means of payment. If we have more younger investors that have crypto wallets, I think by some accounts, Coinbase alone has 70 million account holders. It's likely that from a behavioral standpoint, they might want to hold a stable value asset like a stable coin in their wallet, transact with a friend, buy something. And so there's a lot of work being done to mainstream those as a more efficient means of payment. The use cases are not only in the cryptosphere and in retail transactions or retail payments, but one might argue that it's a more efficient way of doing cross-border payment versus the correspondent banking system, which is slow and very expensive. If I could send $1 million to settle a transaction with a supplier in Europe and do that for pennies instantaneously. That's quite attractive. So people are trying to bring these capabilities into mainstream financial applications. In fact, thinking about the potential impact on traditional industry, some of you know that El Salvador now accepts Bitcoin as an official currency in the country. And the president of El Salvador estimates that citizens living abroad remit about $400 million back to El Salvador each year. When you think about the fees that are paid, somewhere between 5 and 10%, it gets quite expensive. And so when you think about, again, whether it's Bitcoin or some other stable coin or asset on a blockchain, you get massive efficiency in doing the same types of remittances much faster and for much lower cost. And so that's just a slight window into sort of the potential of the technology outside of a pure crypto use case, let's call it.
Yeah, great. Jason, how do, I guess this is a multi-part question. First of all, do you own crypto yourself? Do you have any investments yourself? Tom, I'm assuming you have a couple because we chatted beforehand, but what about you, Jason?
I don't, but I do own both physical gold and gold stocks. And so, but I'm relatively old, probably compared to a lot of people in the room. So I understand, again, I wouldn't use that as any sort of lack of faith in it per se. It's just that I need to learn a little bit more about it, but I don't own crypto.
And then your institutional clients, Jason, how are they buying it right now? I mean, when you talk with them, you have a view, but do they already own it, or are they putting it into viewing it as a part of a diversified portfolio?
So, Dan, I would say, and this is my own impression, is that the more institutional an investor is, meaning, let's say, a large pension plan, they're really trying to invest in blockchain itself through investments in companies, and they don't really have the ability necessarily, or no one really wants to take the risk of owning Bitcoin outright, right? Because let's see, if you think about a big state pension plan, one of the things they're always trying to do in any asset they buy is try to get a good Sharpe ratio, which is a fancy way of saying they're trying to get returns without a lot of risk or volatility. And I would say that's one of the issues with large institutional investors, is that while it is a medium of exchange, while it's a unit of account, it is volatile because it's new. And so now, if you go, let's say, a little bit closer to an end user, let's say a registered investment advisor or a wealth manager, it's very clear that their clients want to have exposure to crypto, to digital assets, to use Tom's phrase. That also is presenting some problems, I think, depending on the investment advisor. I think many want to have investments there, but I think they too are using the equities, the stocks of the companies that are creating blockchain and exchanges and all the rest. I think that's the way they're playing it, mainly because the rules on actually owning crypto, as I said before, are so nebulous now. Now there is very clearly, if you saw President Biden a couple of weeks ago, a month ago, issued an executive order to establish rules. SEC Commissioner Gensler is also talking about trying to establish rules in terms of exchange, how it might trade on an exchange, whether it's considered a currency, all of those things that would make it much more institutional, I think, once those rules are set. But again, another long-winded answer to your question, which is to say, I would say individuals want to buy it, institutions want to buy it as well, but there are regulatory and legal hurdles and career risk associated with it now that probably make it a little bit further off from being a real asset class at the institutional level.
Right. Yeah,
Dan, I have some perspective. I agree with Jason on the institutional question, but I think just some perspective, because our clients are institutions, completely agree that the more traditional institutions, your pensions and endowments, they may be structurally inhibited from investing in the space due to regulation and other concerns. But if you broaden the definition of institution to include family offices, hedge funds, a growing number of crypto-native asset managers, we do a survey every year, and last year we surveyed 1,000 institutions globally, and about a third of respondents in the US already own digital assets. Now, if you break it down by segment, you're going to see a much higher percentage of respondents saying yes in the family office or hedge fund segment than you would pension endowment. But year on year, we see steady increases not only in ownership but purchase intent, and I think there are a couple ways to maybe think about that. If you look at Bitcoin off to the side as a scarce digital asset or digital gold, then for macro investors, it is, notwithstanding the volatility and other things, it does represent something that looks like a hedge to sort of macro conditions. I've come to the conclusion that if you look at these other tokens, what it really represents in many respects is a liquid public venture market, right? If you believe that these technologies are going to change industries and change finance, and that's a very subjective view, then you have the ability to participate in these protocols and own these things directly. If we rewind to the 90s and we said, boy, the internet's going to be great, how do I buy Google on a pre-IPO basis? Well, I need to know someone who knows someone who knows someone. So you have to think about this as a bit of primordial soup of technology, right? That's why there are so many thousand of these protocols. Not all of them will succeed. Many of them are outright frauds. But again, if we had complete visibility into what was going on 10, 20, 30 years ago through prior waves of technology innovation, we would have seen that many, many, many startups never made it to the starting line. So I think most of the investors putting Bitcoin aside view this as really their alt sleeve, a venture investment, highly speculative, than something that sits in like their core portfolio.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And for the record, at Palisade, we do not have, for our private wealth management clients, we don't have a dedicated asset class for Bitcoin or other or digital assets. But similarly, we do look for ways to play the periphery, essentially the picks and shovels versus looking for the gold, versus mining the gold itself.
Right.
And I was just interested. So obviously, markets have been much more volatile and have experienced periods of extreme weakness. And Bitcoin wasn't really a port in the storm if you look at it from the standpoint of some talking about it as a storehouse of value, whereas gold was. It did what it was designed to do in a broader sell-off with higher inflation. So I'm just curious, somebody got that wrong.
Yeah, look, we're careful to call it an aspirational store of value. If you look at certain properties, right, it's portability, it's scarcity, it's almost infinite divisibility, the ability to transfer it at low cost to anyone who has a crypto wallet, whether you know them or not, right? It's this marriage of technology and money. And so it's potentially a store of value, potentially a better store of value than gold, just given some of those other properties. But it's still very early in its adoption cycle, number one. I also think, coming back to my earlier comment about this being effectively a big alts or venture play in some respects, it's a risk asset. Right? And I think you probably need to go through a few cycles, macro cycles, to know actually how does something like Bitcoin behave over longer periods of time. I don't think you can look at one cycle and say, boy, it's a hedge or not. But like anything else, like it's the definition of money, it's a social construct. If enough people think something has value, then it has value. I guess if enough people think that it's a monetary store of value, then over time with broader adoption, I think maybe the volatility subsides and it may behave differently. But we do some studies that over long periods of time with periodic rebalancing, it does have a positive effect on portfolio returns. But if you take a snapshot of, let's say November of last year till now, it's been highly correlated to the S&P, right?
Right.
Or the
NASDAQ.
Or the
perhaps.
NASDAQ,
Yeah.
but there are periods where it's uncorrelated. And so again, like any investment, no one's telling you to put all your money in Bitcoin, but it's like any other allocation. If it's 1% or 2%, it's relative to your risk tolerance. So we're not ready to call it a store of value yet, but it has some very interesting properties that an increasing number of investors are starting to think about.
Yeah. Jason, you and I have chatted about this. I'd love to get, you have such a great perspective on the Federal Reserve and the viewpoint there. How do they view digital assets, digital currency? My guess is it's not very positively, but I'm just going out on a limb here.
Yeah, listen, I think it's safe to say that if you look at the global policymakers, they view it's changing, it's evolving. I think they're becoming more accepting. But also, if you have to think of it from the standpoint of, let's say, a central banker or a secretary of the Treasury, it can be seen as a threat and is seen as a threat by both people on the left and the right, just to the extent to which it damages the seigniorage of the sovereign, right? Or the ability of a country to either collect taxes or to affect monetary policy. And so if you look at comments by, let's say, Larry Summers or Ken Rogoff or Janet Yellen, they may be evolving, but they're generally, it seems to me, a little bit afraid of it, because just to the extent to which I think a lot of those people don't even like cash, they don't even like physical dollars and cents. If we're up to them, everything would probably be, and I think this is the way it's going. I think you're going to have central bank digital currencies, and there is a chance that there's no more physical money. Because that eliminates a lot of the slippage. If you're someone that wants to collect taxes, let's say, that eliminates some of the slippage. And if you're interested in social control, those are other things in terms of digital assets. The anonymity of, let's say, something like Bitcoin is something that is not appealing if you're, let's say, running a country and you're interested in social control. Whereas if you're interested in freedom, Bitcoin, looks like a dream. Larry Summers spoke at our macro conference last year, and he said the idea that it's not going to be regulated in some meaningful way is some sort of, he called it a libertarian fantasy. I think that, and so we'll see what happens. I think that the good news, generally speaking, for the, let's say the asset class in general, because I think it's clearly moving in that way, is that there are certain governments, I think, that are ahead of the U.S., maybe like Sweden or Bank of England or ECB, in terms of Bitcoin. I think the U.S. is purposely being a little bit more deliberate in this because it is the reserve currency. It probably wants to see some smaller central banks, like, let's say, Sweden's Riksbank. They would probably like to see them do some experiments on this in terms of their economy before we do it here in the States. But I would say, generally speaking, to answer your question directly, Dan, I think it's largely seen among economic policymakers and Washington-type people as a threat, and also something that makes monetary policy a bit harder. I'll just use one quick example here. I know we have some time, but I don't want to take up too much time. But I think it was 2015, 2016, one of the shiny new tools of monetary policy was something called negative interest rates, which, again, you get into, with all this quantitative easing, all the things you're doing, you're getting to really mind-bending kind of concepts where you actually are paying someone to save money. It's hard to conceive of that. But that was the idea in Japan, was that you have negative interest rates in order to stimulate the economy because you make it painful to save money. And you're encouraging people to take more risk. That was the theory at the Bank of Japan. The first thing that people did in Japan when negative interest rates were introduced was most people went out and bought a safe, the first thing they did. And then the second thing they did is they went to the bank and took out physical cash to put in their safe at home. So the idea was to get people to take more risk, and what wound up happening is that people wound up taking a lot less risk. The banking system actually shrank. It didn't expand as they hoped it would. And so that's why I think there's a lot of Ken Rogoff in particular was very that's where he made his comments about physical cash. He said, this actually would have worked for us as central bankers and central planners. This would have worked perfectly if it wasn't for the darn cash. And so if you don't like cash, you're going to hate crypto or digital assets because it's less traceable. So anyway, long-winded way to say I think it's largely seen as a threat. I think, though, if there's news about this, I think that there's a recognition that this isn't going to go away. And so, as I mentioned, President Biden issued an executive order to study this and come up with ways. Commissioner Gensler is putting rules in place so that there's maybe some more guardrails for individuals, and so that they can control it. Ultimately, I think the goal is to have a Fed digital asset that might replace cash. That's a guess, but it's my I would bet some money on that. That's ultimately where this is going.
Yeah. And Tom, would it make sense to make it a storehouse of value? Would it make sense to back Bitcoin with gold or some other asset that has a perceived value? Gold comes to mind simply because you've got 20% of the world's gold is in central bank vaults around the world. And does that make sense? Is that being contemplated? Is that something that we might see eventually?
Yeah, I mean, in fact, you have digital representations of gold today. You have Pax Gold as an example, which is a token that's backed by physical gold held at a trust company. And this is another exciting aspect of the technology, moving away from native digital assets, is the ability to represent lots of different types of financial exposures in a more efficient medium for exchange, whether it's gold, whether it's an illiquid security. People are tokenizing real estate, private company shares, which all suffer from the lack of a consistent market structure and a fairly significant administrative burden just to allow people to buy these things and transact in them. So I think there are significant applications of the technology in traditional finance, which we're only starting to evaluate. But one would be, you could create a infinitely divisible, highly portable representation of gold that sits in a vault somewhere. So it's very exciting.
Yeah, my late partner and our founder, Marty Berman, back in the 1980s, he asked me to buy some gold for him. It was a considerable quantity, in excess of $1 million. What he didn't realize was there was a Brinks truck that was going to show up to his house with bars of gold, and he was going to have to figure out where to store it all. So, so I think that would have helped quite a bit if he had a digital asset for something like that.
I will just maybe add on the regulatory front. I think it is interesting. We've seen go from sort of, I wouldn't say benign neglect, but okay, what is this early stage technology? Doesn't mean much to some of what Jason was talking about. Now we've seen there are more bills in front of Congress right now around crypto legislation than at any time since 2009, really, when the space came into being. And there's growing bipartisan consensus that this is a revolutionary technology that the U.S. needs to begin thinking about. Quite frankly, in competition with other jurisdictions where rules are more permissive and there's more innovation. And I also think, coming back to the central bank digital currency, there are macro implications, because some of you know that the Chinese have a digital RMB, which I believe they rolled out on a test basis a couple of years ago, but really went into full force during the Beijing Olympics. And that's got interesting geopolitical implications now when you think about what's gone on in the world over the past couple of months, where $650 billion of Russian assets in foreign bank accounts was frozen, and the Saudis are now seemingly open to trading oil denominated in RMB. So this technology and its virality now has significant macro implications. And I think while you'll probably see the government move a bit faster on something like a CBDC, perhaps as much for defensive purposes as for social policy purposes. So I think that's going to be quite interesting. And then there's another interesting argument, which is if stable coins are properly regulated and are digital representations of dollars, is that a better way to get this into the market than waiting for the government to say, we've created this thing, now who wants to use it? when people are already using these other things in anger. Right? So how do you think about regulating stable coins within the existing banking system and harnessing the power of entrepreneurs and existing bank infrastructure versus building this monolithic CBDC? It's going to be very interesting to watch.
Yeah. Jason, I'm going to throw something at you for your immediate reaction. Can these be instruments of war? Can this be weaponized the way in a way?
Well, it's such a great question, and I would just say, I don't want to sound patronizing to you and Peter, but this is first of all, I'm finding this a fascinating conversation, just listening to Tom and you and Peter, and one of the things I respect a lot about what the Veru Symposium does many times is that it marries the study of history and finance, and I think as you're bringing up, in the United States, we're kind of spoiled, I think, to a certain extent, to the extent to which we have the reserve currency. Most of us don't really think about what is money in this country. Certainly young people. I have a son in college. He didn't think about what money, but I think a lot about what money is now. And you're seeing in places like Russia, because of some of the sanctions, money might be a Rolex watch, or it might be diamonds, or it might be something you can get out of the country, or that's somewhat portable. And I think personally that there is a weaponization of finance that's going on, and the U.S., in my opinion, despite our best efforts to screw it up, I think is shown itself to continue to be the reserve currency that has a lot of influence. I would imagine, I don't know this, it's certainly not my bailiwick, but I would imagine that China is looking at what has happened to Russia in terms of the sanctions and the currency, although the rubles come back, and probably rethinking perhaps some of its own ambitions and its relationship with the United States, because as we know, the RMB is pegged to the dollar, and you probably don't want to get on the wrong side of that if your goal, as China's goal is essentially to maintain social stability, right? That is probably job number 1 through 3 in China. But to answer your question directly, I think there's no question about it. And one last thing I would say about this idea of what is money. I've had in my career I've come into contact with people who are very good investors in things like biotech stocks that happen to be from places like Armenia, or another client that's from Cuba. They think about money very differently than an American would. And both own significant amounts of gold, even though the fellow from Cuba was a biotech company portfolio manager. So that's pretty out there on the fiat issue. It requires a lot of trust to buy that. And the guy from Armenia actually would carry gold on him. He lived on the Upper East Side and had a place in Florida, but it never quite left him that these things can be your wealth can be taken away, and so it's a long-winded kind of hairy dog story to say there's no question in my mind, and I think there's probably to an extent to which the United States might not have realized it as much as it did. It holds a lot of cards as the reserve currency.
Yeah. Boy, that guy with the gold must have been in great shape.
I think it was just enough so he could. He kept it next to his passport, and it was just in case he had to scram. He had to get out. Whatever was going to happen, I guess it would get him to. He had enough cash on him to get to the airport. I don't know what the quite thing was, but anyway.
Yeah. Well, why don't we open it up to some questions from the audience, because Jason, Tom, and I could go to the wee hours on this. All that's missing is a bottle of my dad's scotch. So, But why don't we, anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
When Jason said that he's going to bet his money on the Federal Reserve or a single bank digital currency becoming, or like coming around and them issuing the central bank digital currency, how do you balance, because when you say that, the first thing that comes to my mind that kind of scares me is that they're now able to just track like every single purchase, and we're just under the microscope even more. And you said China has one that's in place, and we all know like there's social scoring stuff that's going on, and they're tracking their citizens a lot. So how do you balance developing a central bank digital currency in a way that is going to kind of still give citizens the anonymity of like a physical dollar? Like, how do you balance those two things?
Yeah, I mean, I can make it take. I'm an advisor to something called the Digital Dollar Project, which was created by Chris Giancarlo, who was the former chair of the CFTC. And one of the, and basically it's really more of a group of people that get together and think about some of these issues, and where practical advise policymakers and others on how to think about this. And privacy is a really important consideration. How that gets reflected in the actual engineering of the digital currency, because we're not working on one yet, is yet to be seen. But I'm fairly certain your China example is an interesting one, that it just becomes part of the surveillance apparatus. I mean, the other thing too, the Wall Street Journal, there was an interesting editorial months ago now. I wish I remember what month, but the other thing, remember, this is programmable money, right? We come back to this operating system analogy. You have these things called smart contracts, which are effectively programs that run autonomously on these networks. You could create a smart contract that says, okay, we're delivering aid, but if it's not spent within a certain amount of time, it disappears, or it can only be spent for certain things. And you could argue the merits of whether that's good or bad, but it is a new technology, a tool that requires, I think, a different set of considerations and rules. And there's always going to be that balance between utility and privacy. We see that in other parts of our lives. What you need ID for and where you don't need ID. It's a knot that needs to be untied.
Yeah, Jason, do you have any comments on that?
I think, Tom, it really, like most things, this comes down to a political decision that will be hashed out in the United States, at least, mercifully. We have a republic, and it'll be hashed out by elections, and it wouldn't surprise me if this became a pretty significant political issue in the fullness of time, because there will be a wide range. Tom's absolutely right. There are a number of bills. Senator Gillibrand, Senator Toomey, a lot of people are looking at this. But I think when you get down to brass tacks in terms of how a government conducts monetary policy, and what kind of leeway they want to necessarily give people that may not necessarily have the best of intentions, how much leeway they want to give them in terms of transactions and all the rest of it. It's a very delicate balance. And again, it will be a political decision that's made. I am skeptical, though, I have to say, that there'll be a currency that's completely untraceable or not subject to anti-money laundering rules or other things that traditional finance has to deal with.
Right. Great. Any other? Yeah.
So I guess since we're on the topic of future of digital assets, with the current climate change, and there's factories opening up to mining cryptocurrencies, it seems like both Tom and Jason are very optimistic in terms of government regulations on digital assets. Do you guys think the value of blockchain will increase as government regulations increase, or do you think will plummet? Since there's limited amount of cryptocurrencies, as you mentioned.
Yeah, yeah. And by the way, I chair the ESG committee. Since you mentioned ESG, I chair the ESG committee at Palisade, and they're not so friendly. So maybe Tom, as you talk a little, as you answer part of it.
That question.
Yeah.
But Jason, do you want to answer the question just about regulation generally?
I'll just do something quick, because again, I think we're all, to a certain extent, we're all guessing, right? This is pioneering. I would say it was interesting when China put significant restrictions on crypto and released its own cryptocurrency. The value of Bitcoin went up, right? So now the U.S. is again the reserve currency, so it's a bit different, I think. But I would be kind of betting on the idea that the government's going to make it difficult to use crypto the way it has been used in the past, but in many ways, to the extent to which it is truly fixed in terms of the amount that's in circulation. Tom told me the other day that you have to remind me of I guess we have 2 million more Bitcoin to be mined, and how long it will take to mine them. But that seems to me to suggest that the value might go up. The more regulation that's placed on it, and there'll be big. I think, as Tom said, there'll be big, probably winners and losers of dispersion among digital assets. Where some will fall by the wayside and go to zero, and others may get a real benefit actually. And it's usually the incumbents that benefit most in anything. Incumbents generally benefit most from regulation. The people that are already there and have the most market share, they're the people that generally want regulation.
Sure.
Because it cuts off competition.
Yeah, I think in this space, I think we're pro-regulation, right? We think that the industry grows if investors have clarity around what they're buying, where it trades, the transparency of the price they pay on an exchange or from an intermediary. And we're highly regulated now. We're regulated as a trust bank in the state of New York. We're regulated by 40-odd states. There's still a lack of regulatory clarity on certain things, but we are able to operate a business within the confines of the existing regulation. So I think regulation actually grows the industry. And as Jason said earlier, regulation is one of the reasons why, or lack of regulation or lack of clarity is one of the reasons traditional institutions are a little bit reluctant to engage. Now, on the issue of ESG, it's a very long story, but I'll just try to lay out the fault lines, right? So you read things like the Bitcoin blockchain consumes the same amount of electricity each year as New Zealand, right? Okay, probably true. Pick a country, right? I would say a couple of things. The energy mix used to mine Bitcoin, and by the way, mining is what secures the value of the network, right? So if you believe that the Bitcoin blockchain is something of good for humanity, you should be willing to pay something for it. And I'm not saying what that number is, but there is a value in that technology and it consumes electricity. That's the cost of it. The energy mix used to mine Bitcoin is increasingly green, right? Because Bitcoin miners look for cheap sources of electricity. They look for stranded wind and solar in West Texas. They look for hydro. When there's a lot of mining in China, every spring season, the miners would move from coal-fired power in the north of China to hydropower in the south of China. Plentiful, right? And in fact, we have a small mining operation at Fidelity, which we've maintained for about 7 years because it gives us insight into how the network operates. And we're experimenting with flare gas. If you've driven down no offense to anyone from New Jersey, but if you drive down the New Jersey Turnpike, you see those towers with the gas just flaring off. That pollutes the atmosphere. You can cap that, you can convert that to energy, you can mine Bitcoin and then transfer that value somewhere else. So I think there are arguments on both sides of the equation. And the last thing I'll leave you with is more of a philosophical question. Does anyone want to guess how many hours of YouTube video are watched globally per day?
With my son being the swing factor, by the way, because that's the only thing he watches.
1 billion hours of video per day. That consumes electricity, right? So again, it comes back to, is it valuable or not? And I think, again, coming back to the analogy of this being an emerging technology, we may not know yet, but there are many different ways to think about that question.
Anyone else? Yes.
Hi. So you mentioned earlier that, crypto has been, at least for the past few months, has been moving pretty evenly with the markets, like the S&P and the NASDAQ and stuff like that. And I'm a little wary of, investing in crypto. I don't have money, obviously. I'm a college student. But do you think that, in the future, crypto might be a way that, you can predict markets or, just kind of the next wave of predictions for analysts and stuff like that?
So okay, so interesting. Okay, so two things. First of all, blockchains are public. You can see every transaction on the blockchain network, right? So there are people that are looking at flows between wallets, flows onto exchange, off exchange, and other metrics. What is the average price of every current holder of Bitcoin on the network? And making inferences about which way the markets are going to move. And this is all public, right? It's just a different type of analysis. So there are people that are, is it going up or down based on those fundamentals? Coming back to the prediction, there are a couple of protocols that run on top of blockchains that are prediction markets, right? There was a prediction market called Intrade in the US that got shut down by the CFTC, I think in 2005. You could bet on whether George Bush or Hillary Clinton would be president or whether the Giants would win the Super Bowl, and it was considered to be a futures market. There are a couple of protocols. One I think is called Gnosis, where any two people in the world can bet on those same things, and at scale, you could use that to think about predictions for financial assets or politics or something else. Which is kind of an interesting use case.
Anybody else have a?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So since we've talked about digital currencies and assets, I have to ask you about NFTs, what your views are on that, because so far I've heard that either NFTs are really innovative or they're utter stupid. They're utterly stupid. That's what I've heard so far. So what are your views on that?
Silly, as we talked before, I think. But
Jason, I mean, I'm happy to answer that, but I don't want to. Do you have a view?
Oh, don't be silly. No, go. Please, I would say I'm leaning on the NFTs. I wouldn't. I'm even more skeptical on NFTs than I am on crypto. Put it that way.
Yep. So I think that the concept is really interesting, right? So my son is a musician, avid musician, would love to pursue a career in music, but the economics of the music industry don't support it. NFTs are fundamentally a way to do digital rights management. I can create a song. I can effectively control how many are sold or a piece of digital art. And every time that thing transacts, as the original owner of that, I effectively get a royalty, which is really cool. So I think there's something very durable in the concept, but I think like many things, the intersection of social media, memification, get rich quick, I think you've seen just an explosion of activity, which I think at some point it probably already has started to normalize. But like many trendy technologies, you tend to crater before you start to build up for the longer term. And by the way, like many financial assets and contracts are effectively NFTs. You think about a swap agreement or some OTC derivative between two counterparties. There's only one of those, right? So applying that same concept, again, in traditional finance also has some applicability. But it's been a little frothy.
Probably have time for one more, and then the rest will have to happen at the reception, I think, right here.
Yeah, so I just had one question. I believe at the start of the conversation there was a Bill Gates quote that was alluded to, saying that crypto could be a really powerful tool, particularly for developing economies. So I'm wondering if that's something you agree with, if maybe you could unpack that a little bit, and if not, maybe why you sort of disagree with that view in terms of crypto as sort of a powerful tool, particularly for more poor or developing economies.
boy, Jason, I'm glad you're here, and you can answer that one.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think again, it really depends. The viability of one's currency is largely a political decision that's made by the people that run the country. And so I think in the hands of capable leaders of emerging economies, it could be enormously helpful, mainly because it would probably keep some control of inflation. I would say similarly, for a lot of emerging economies, there is a sense in which having a currency backed by gold or backed by something that's not readily available or something that's somewhat scarce, I think would probably do a lot to help some of those countries maintain some sort of store of wealth, help their citizens transact businesses, establish property rights, all of those things that, again, we take for granted in the developed world. Again, though, I would just say that that's probably a level of discipline that many leaders of developing countries would be unwilling to adopt. It's certainly not. I mean, in developed countries, in our own country, there's no interest in having any discipline, monetary discipline at all. So it seems like a stretch. El Salvador is an very interesting test case on that. And so again, I think it can be very useful. I agree with that, but it again will require a lot of discipline and leadership to make it as useful as it potentially could be.
It's one of the reasons why, at Palisade, we've always been cautious with emerging markets, because not only do you have to get the fundamentals of the country right, you have to get the currency right. Because you could get wiped out just having the currency wrong. And to Jason's point, that would be very helpful to encourage more investment in those countries to allow them to grow. I don't know if you have anything you want to add on that.
No, I agree. I mean, I think, remember, blockchain technology is not always synonymous with financial use cases or Bitcoin. So whether, I think one of the Central American countries, Guatemala, Honduras, or El Salvador maybe, tried to move their property registry onto a blockchain, immutable electronic records. So I think, the same way that, when you travel in Asia, they've got fantastic mobile networks, as they went right from not having phones to mobile. They skip landlines. And you go to China and, they don't know what a check is, because they went right from cash to digital mobile applications. And so I think that in terms of modernizing industry or financial systems, yeah, you could argue that the technology is quite enabling.
Yeah. Well, Jason, Tom, thank you very, very much for joining us today. This was a great discussion. I want to add on a small anecdote about our dad. He asked me to explain to him what he was calling Betcoin, because he could never get it. He could never get anything right. He misquoted everything all the time. He had very interesting use of the language. And after I finished explaining it to him, he goes, and I kept saying, "Dad, it's Bitcoin, not Betcoin." He said, "Well, after you explained it to me, I think I was right the first time." So thank you, Jason. Thank you, Tom.
I want to add my thanks to you as well, Jason, Dan, and Tom. What a wonderful night. Did everyone appreciate that? And Peter, we love your commitment to the symposium. It's terrific. There's a reason we call this the premier thought event of the year, because you're not just entertained here by these events, you're all going to leave here thinking about what you heard here and discussing it. And I would encourage the faculty and the students to engage in that over the next couple of weeks, what you heard tonight and your views on it. For those of you that are in the audience here live, we have a reception at Allback Hall, and I hear there might be a raffle as well, so I look forward to seeing you up there. And for those of you that joined us virtually, thanks for joining us. We appreciate it, and have a good evening.